Joy has worked for the Institute for European Environmental Policy, WWF International, Greenpeace International, and the International Maritime Organization. From 2000 to 2003, she served on the board of the Verification, Research, Training, and Information Center. Joy is also a member of the International Law Association. Her lecture topic today is Climate Change and Global Justice. Please welcome Joy Hyvarinen.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to follow such distinguished speakers this morning on a topic which is of a great concern to FIELD. FIELD is a small non-profit. We work to strengthen international law for people and the environment. We work to make connections between people and organizations and issues, including today, I hope. And we empower others to achieve change. We provide training and advice. Many justice-related questions arise in connection with climate change. At the global level, there are two in particular. One relates to the undeniable historical responsibility for climate change that developed countries have, and how to share the effort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions fairly, taking into account that some developing countries have very rapidly increasing emissions. This is at the heart of the current climate change negotiations. The other justice-related issue, which I'm going to focus on today, relates to unavoidable loss and damage from climate change. This is becoming an increasingly urgent topic. As we've heard from other speakers this morning, the outlook for greenhouse gas emission reductions that would be sufficient to put the world on a safe path is not very good. We heard a reference to the 2 degrees Celsius target that governments have agreed would be a desirable goal to keep warming to a safe level. Many vulnerable countries, small island states and least developed countries, would argue that a much lower limit is needed to keep them safe. They have argued for a limit of 1.5 degrees. In any case, we're nowhere near either of those. Current emission reduction pledges and commitments put the world on a path to something like a 4-degree warming, which would have very, very significant negative impact. The outlook since the Doha Climate Change Conference in Qatar in December last year is not very promising. Governments came to a compromise agreement in Qatar, which includes negotiating a new climate change agreement by the deadline of 2015. It doesn't seem very realistic at this stage to expect much progress by then. The political positions are locked. There is little to inspire confidence in change right now. So where does this leave vulnerable countries and communities? They're facing increasing threats to human security, and this is human security in a very broad sense. Food security, crops are being affected. Health security, for example, malaria is spreading and will be spreading to a much wider range in Africa, for example. And they can expect more negative impact. What are the responses available at the global level? What can countries do to try to address this? There are 3 particularly important possible options. One option is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the international climate change negotiations. Another one is the possibility of an international lawsuit by a country damaged by climate change against a polluting country. And the third route is discussions about the UN's development, the United Nations Development Agenda after 2015. Discussions have just begun about that. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as we've heard this morning, is not at the moment a place for much optimism when it comes to greenhouse gas emission reductions. A positive development has been that negotiations have taken up the issue of loss and damage in implicit or explicit recognition of the fact that loss and damage to countries from climate change is increasingly likely, or it is happening already, and more will be happening. That's a very good development that this is an agenda item. And I should say that Field is a big supporter of the multilateral process. We believe that the UN Framework Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and a future agreement are extremely important parts of the global response to climate change, but we're also realistic. Right now, it's hard to envisage much meaningful progress in the negotiations about loss and damage. One particular issue concerns the fear of developed countries, large developed countries, the United States and others, of anything, any of references to compensation, any negotiating language that would be agreed that could in some way provide a basis for a finding of legal liability for damage. So there's not enough progress in these negotiations. The idea of a lawsuit, a country-to-country lawsuit, has drawn increasing interest in the last few years among academics and among others. This could be based on treaty obligations or on the very well accepted customary international law principle of no harm, that you're not allowed to damage other countries. If a state was found to be responsible for a wrongful act, if a state was found liable, this would give rise to a right to reparations for the damaged country, including potentially compensation, financial compensation. There is interest in this. There is, it is a route that deserves some attention, but it's probably not a very likely successful prospect. It would be not in the short term. It would take a long time, be complicated, require a lot of effort. One country winning a claim wouldn't help the other countries that are suffering from climate change damage. And we're talking here about countries that have done very, very little to contribute to the problem. It's something that needs to be kept in mind, that small island states, for example, least developed countries, have done almost nothing to contribute to climate change, but they are suffering the worst consequences. One of the things that complicates the litigation, the international litigation issue, also has to do with the fact that it's not just as simple as victim states suing big polluting states, for example, small island states suing the US. There are also claims within countries, across jurisdictions, and I think the one concern for some countries that are being damaged by climate change would be that they themselves could be subject to claims within their own countries from marginalized populations, for example. And so I think that's one of the things that might be potentially holding back some of these international legal claims. The third possibility, the third route forward at the global level is perhaps the most interesting right now. The United Nations have begun discussing what the United Nations Development Agenda after 2015 should be. The Millennium Development Goals, the big development goals agreed in 2000, which aim to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, they address health, they address environmental sustainability. Those are ending in 2015, so something needs to come after them. After the Rio conference, the Rio +20 conference last summer, the Conference on Environment and Sustainable Development, there is also a proposal to agree new sustainable development goals. The proposed new sustainable development goals would be global in nature, and they would also apply to developed countries, which I think make them interesting. The Millennium Development Goals, with one exception, have focused very much on developing countries, so new sustainable development goals would be a new ballgame. There are various UN processes underway to try to define this post-2015 agenda, and that includes a high-level panel appointed by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. This high-level panel is chaired by the UK Prime Minister and by the presidents of Indonesia and Liberia. It's due to report in May, so it'll be interesting to see what they recommend. One of the things everyone from the World Bank to the UN Development Programme agrees is that climate change has emerged as an enormous development challenge. It could set back development efforts by decades. It's a huge problem, and the impacts, Field is arguing very, very strongly that the impacts on poor and vulnerable countries and communities of climate change has to be a priority in the UN's post-2015 development agenda. So far, that's not something that we've been hearing much recognition for in the official discussions. So we're waiting with interest to see what the high-level panel report in May will say. So from the perspective of countries and communities that are being damaged by climate change, the current situation isn't very encouraging. The prospects in the UNFCCC negotiations are not good. An international legal claim is a possible option, but perhaps not very solid and might not be useful for more than a handful of countries. And there's a question mark around the UN's post-2015 agenda at this stage. And of course, a big concern for all of us, for every country, is the lack of sufficient emissions agreement on lack of sufficient emissions reductions. But from the point of view of these countries, they are looking at increasing damage, unavoidable damage. And keep in mind that even if the world stopped emitting greenhouse gas emissions totally today, we're still locked into unavoidable climate change of at least 0.6 degrees or so. And slowing that is going to be going beyond that is going to be extremely difficult. So we're thinking about this in Field at the moment, and I want to take this opportunity to set out some of the ideas, some new ideas that we're exploring now. And I would really welcome comments either here, perhaps during the break, or subsequently by email. Because our main thought is that we really need new ideas, new approaches to both of these two issues, achieving greater emissions reductions and addressing impacts on vulnerable countries and communities. And we're asking ourselves the question, can we learn something from transitional justice? Transitional justice refers to the collection of mechanisms and approaches that are used in countries, in post-conflict countries, in countries that are making the transition from periods of large-scale human rights abuse and violence to more stable societies. That's an idea that might strike people as controversial, so I want to be very, very clear that the global field is not saying that the global policy implications on climate change, that those implications on vulnerable countries and communities, that they would be the same as the situations of countries that are recovering from or trying to recover from violence and large-scale human rights abuse. What we're saying is, or what we're asking is, can some of the ideas and approaches and tools translate into new approaches and tools at the global level when it comes to addressing climate change, or can we somehow share some of the learning, develop some new ideas by considering transitional justice approaches? And I should be clear that transitional justice it's an evolving field. Many definitions are not very clear. There are criticisms and there are disagreements, but there are things there that I think provide food for thought. Oops, sorry. Transitional justice involves, first of all, justice. Through the courts or in other ways, it may involve criminal justice, punishments. It involves truth-seeking and truth-telling, usually as an important part, recognizing what really happened, acknowledging what really happened, and telling the truth, and governance reforms. And it includes reparations for victims, reparations such as financial compensation, public apologies, help for victims' families, and so on. Excuse me. The aim is to achieve reconciliation and transformation of society and stable, peaceful development. That's something that interests us at Field. There's no doubt that new approaches are needed at the international level to somehow move forward in addressing climate change. These new approaches need to deliver justice. Justice when it comes to fair sharing of the effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And justice when it comes to helping countries and people damaged by climate change. But these approaches should also make reconciliation possible and unity, we think. And I want to emphasize the Field does not hesitate to pursue adversarial approaches when it's appropriate. We can be very outspoken as critics, but we also believe that cooperation is extremely important. So at the global level, if we explore ideas related to transitional justice, we can look at how to help damaged countries and communities. And I think there would be some value in exploring truth-seeking and truth-telling exercises. Much of the international climate change negotiations involves pointing the finger at the other side and each side spinning their perspective on whose fault climate change is and who should take more action. One place where perhaps, or one process where some of this perhaps could happen is the UN's post-2015 agenda, but there's a big question mark around that. In any case, climate change is an absolutely unprecedented global challenge. It's really testing the limits of humanity's ability to govern our own impacts on the planet, and perhaps we have exceeded those limits already. Any ideas and approaches really need to be explored at this stage to see if we can find solutions. Field certainly believes very strongly that international law can help with that. Sometimes it's the job of international law to say who's right and who's wrong, and to punish those who've done wrong. But we also think that international law is much grander than that. International law is really about creating a structure where unity and reconciliation and collaboration and cooperation is possible. It's really, we believe very strongly that it should be a force for good. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute honor speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. That was a wonderful presentation. We can take some questions now.
Nicola from Earth Focus Foundation. Can you tell me, are you involved with Ecocide, with the movement for Ecocide, with Polly Higgins?
No, we're not. It's not something we're actively working on.
No.
We're aware of that. It's partly to do. We're small. We have certain priorities that we focus on.
But you believe in what they're doing. I mean, do you think they can make a difference?
I think it's quite. I think it's very helpful to bring ideas such as that to the international debate. At the moment, I don't. I wouldn't want to say how much difference can it make, but it's a challenge for everyone trying to change the international debate.
So maybe we haven't explained it. Ecocide is a word that this English, she's a lawyer, Polly Higgins, wishes to put in the Rome Treaty beside genocide. And it seems to me that it's very explainable and we could all understand it, and your idea of international law could be very much focused on this as well. And as for the Millennium Development Goals, I think it's broken promises, which is really a dreadful thing to have done to humanity. Maybe we should take the case against the UN. Sorry.
I agree. I agree very much with your comments, including the last ones. Although I would say the problem with taking a case against the UN is that the UN is its member states. The member states take the decisions. But I do want to emphasize very much your point about the broken promises of the Millennium Development Goals. And I think one problem there is that Goal 8, developing a global partnership for development, which would have required certain efforts from developed countries, has received almost no attention. And that's why I think the idea of sustainable development goals that would create expectations in developed countries might be a very good idea.
Hello, my name is Peter and I'm an intern here in ICD and my background is in international law. I mean, I really like the idea that there should be international law, more effective, but I'm not really optimistic because in the end international law is law of consent and states need to commit themselves. And since there's no effective mechanism in place, it's really hard to force basically states to do something in this favor. That's why I think the future could be as well in more regional, so more like European, not international, but regional cooperation, where then it is easier to bring 20, 30 states into cooperation rather than 100, 200 states. So that's my comment.
I think that's a very good comment, and it may very well be possible to make progress at the regional level with in some cases when it's not possible at the international level. I recognize that international law, public international law, is still at what I would call a very primitive stage of development, but it needs to evolve to in my view, to address some of these huge global challenges that we're facing now. And I would say that more often than you think, or than most people think, states do accept international law and at least pretend to be complying with it, which is a little first step at least.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Sadi. I'm from Oman. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. On one hand, the other hand, very disappointed presentations. You're talking about the international law. No one is, what I said my colleague from the focus. Okay. Okay. I don't know. Talking about is all the state is not. It's not what's called agreed about what promised in the Millennium Goal. Just, I'm wondering how is dispute settlement mechanism is working in UN system and other organization. You hear me? It's okay. Sorry.
I could hear you.
Okay, you understand. Just I'm wondering how is dispute settlement mechanism working in this context about the climate change, environment law, international environment law, in the UN system and also in the other organization. Thank you.
In some case, it depends a bit on the case. One problem is, for example, that only about, I think, less than 70 countries have accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, the World Court. So more countries accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of the court would be a big step forward. Other dispute settlement procedures, there are many of them, and for example, the Kyoto Protocol has perhaps the most advanced system, where it actually is, and where perhaps I should perhaps distinguish between compliance mechanisms and specifically dispute settlement. If a country doesn't comply with its obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, there are actually consequences, significant consequences that are possible. For example, it could be suspended, it might not be allowed to participate in emissions trading, and it could also be given a higher emission reduction target, for example. When it comes to dispute settlement, that is arguments between countries, to simplify it, that varies a lot. The Climate Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, actually has dispute settlement provisions that haven't been used. Field has certainly been arguing that one of those dispute settlement options, the establishment of a conciliation commission, is something that should be used. So I think this varies. The response to your question is that it varies very much because there are many different possibilities within the UN system and elsewhere. And a lot of the responsibility for making it work better is with states who need to agree to submit to jurisdiction of various courts and various procedures, and then to accept a binding decision. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, you answered my question, but what you mentioned now, you have virus, court, virus systems in UN system. It's really, I'm wondering why is not bring all into one platform? Why it's going to many justices, many agreements, Kyoto, why is not bring it as a one platform? I'm wondering about that. You can answer about that question, or anyone here attended can answer me about this question?
I think that's a great proposal, and to some extent, if more countries accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court, that could be a beginning. Otherwise, the reasons are the same reasons why the international system is so disorganized in all other aspects too, and needs reform.
You're going to bear the wrath of my frustration. I have mentioned several times in several different forums and symposiums and lectures about the fact that the mean temperature of the Earth, and that's what we're talking about here at any one given period. And I said this yesterday in 1966, I had Ecology 101, and the professor said that a 2% plus or minus variance in the temperature, the mean temperature of the Earth, would be catastrophic. Now, in your presentation, you mentioned the figure 4%. The only reason that you're saying that is because people have said, well, for years we've been hedging that. We've been misrepresenting the figure. So, I don't know if there are any people who do statistics here or mathematicians here, but if we're saying that that the prognosis now is 4 degrees, and when I went to college, it was 2 degrees, then do the math, and necessarily the effects would be far greater than just a factor of 2. So where are we? This is a question that has to be answered. And it's not being answered. If you go on a trip, you like to know where you're going. Or at least if you got enough fuel to get there. And it seems that this question is being, it's being skirted. It's being ignored. Not necessarily by you per se, but where are we? And these kids, these young people here, they need to know where they are, and I need to know it myself. If my professor says, hey, 2% change, plus or minus, catastrophe, and then you come 40 years later and say it's 4%, alarms are going off in my head. You understand? And people need to understand concretely what the situation is. I'm not a scientist, but I understand science. You understand? And so, 1 and 1 is 2. And so where are we? Why is there this reluctance to say, hey, man, we're approaching a catastrophe here? And where are we? Just one other thing. There were some scientists who were doing some studies, some people studying different ancient civilizations, and they were at the bottom of a cliff, and they saw all of these bones from animals. And they were trying to figure out, well, how did we get this collection of animals at the bottom of this cliff? And then they figured out that the indigenous population was driving the herds of deer, whatever it was, to the cliff. Now, obviously, the herds of deer or prey didn't know where the cliff was. You understand? So they went off the edge. Where are we? Do we know how close we are to the cliff?
I think that we're too close. I think some of the scientists in the audience may be able to give a better reply, but governments have certainly jointly set a desirable global goal of limiting the warming to 2 degrees Celsius. As I mentioned before, many vulnerable countries would argue very strongly that that is way past the danger point for them. They have argued for keeping warming to 1.5%. I believe that the estimates for the kind of warming we're heading for based on current emissions reductions, and there's of course uncertainty involved with these things, is somewhere between 3.7 and 6 degrees, which is really not encouraging. And for example, to give you an illustration, I believe that, for example, it would take less than a half-meter sea level rise for Bangladesh to lose 10% of its territory completely. And I think 1.5 degree warming, the expectation is best guess would be the sea level rise would be 75 centimeters. So this is really, happening. It's happening. It's real, and it's very significant. But I don't. Maybe some of the scientists in the audience want to respond.
Just a short comment. We have negotiated the Kyoto Protocol in 2007 and started with negotiations in 1995 or 1997 around. And the emission increase over the last 10 years was by far the largest, and the temperature rises. So what scientists had predicted 10, 15 years ago, how fast the ice will melt in Greenland and so on, the predictions were much too smooth. Reality was accelerating much faster than they had predicted. So I share your concerns. We are at least very close to the cliff.
Isn't it true in the history of the world that we've had ice-free caps?
Sorry.
Ice-free caps.
Yeah. In the past, yes. In the very long past, when the humans were not ready here.
So the mean temperature, that's cyclical, right?
What's the mean temperature? Usually you call it mean temperature of an average of 10 years or whatever. Mm-hmm. 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 And it's rising, at least over the last 100,000 years.
One final question. Sorry.
It's not really a question. I live in Geneva, and I have heard Kofi Annan in front of all the UN employees and many other people say, the UN is we the people. Now, I think the big problem is we, the people, do not realize what's going on in the UN, because you have the country representative who will sit there for hours and say, India wants to say, but he doesn't say, the Indians wish everything to change. This is our responsibility, and through our politicians, is to really make the UN work. And maybe we're all just too laid back and I think just ignorant. We can't, it's not all our faults, but a lot of people in countries that have the vote don't vote. You know, they have this privilege and they don't vote. And think if we all voted in one particular country and said, Mr. Cameron, get over there and change the UN. Maybe we could do something. Sorry, you had a question.
Thank you, Joy. We will take a short break now and come back after that. Thank you.